Good morning, ladies. I remember, because we're coming very close to our 30-year anniversary of building our house, and I've thought a lot about those days of buying the land and deciding where we wanted to put the house, and what a challenge it was to be coming to a wintertime state that we've never experienced before, and trying to build a house our own selves without the knowledge of what it would take to put in a good foundation and a frost wall and all of those things that we'd never even heard of in South Carolina and Georgia. And so we did have to get some really good advice from very, very reliable people that to this day we're grateful to them for their advice. But one of the things that was so important to us is that our house set up above the valley floor on the side of the hills so that we had a good view of the Swan Mountains. And the place that was the most likely was so full of rock. And so we had to get an excavation person that knew what he was doing, and to remove the looser rock, and to actually dynamite some of the rock out of the way so we could get a level place to put in the foundation. And it was just such a big ordeal. Foundations actually cost a lot of money to get it right. And so we felt like we were starting off in the hole, literally, because of the expense of having this foundation put in. And today we're going to look at a place where Jesus talks about a foundation and how important the foundation is long term. One of my other favorite things to do is to watch TV shows on HGTV about old homes that are renovated and made to be beautiful again. And something that comes up quite often, unexpected, is foundation problems. And it so fascinates me to see how committed that contractor is to making sure that foundation is corrected, or else the inspectors will come and they will say they won't pass inspection, and you can't go further with the project until you make sure that that's done correctly so that you can pass all the inspections. And so foundations really, really are critically important. And today we're going to look at a parable that Jesus tells two different times on two different occasions. And it's in the context of Jesus teaching large crowds. We don't know if it's two different occasions or just one sermon recorded by two different people, Matthew and Luke. But I believe that it's two different occasions, because in the Matthew account, he says that they are on a mountainside. The people are listening from a mountainside. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. And the one in Luke is called the Sermon on the Plain. And it mentions that it's out in a level place. So I'm pretty sure there were two different occasions, but the same parable is told by Jesus. Now, when I think about the Sermon on the Mount, especially, more so than the Sermon on the Plain, it's very short. But the one in Matthew is 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7. And it's very extensive. I kind of liken it to a king, a king who is coming into his kingdom, and he's laying down his expectations for his subjects. And if you've ever read the Sermon on the Mount, you know it's a steep hill to climb, literally and figuratively. our king is giving something like, kind of like a new president gives an inaugural address, but our king's address contains really high expectations, actually impossibly high. His point is that the standard for those of his kingdom aren't attainable without his spirit living in us. He talks about things like anger, divorce, lust, forgiving our enemies, not judging others, not hating our brother, murder, being a murder that takes place in the heart. And both accounts, though, in both of the sermons, they both end with this admonition to hear his words and do them. Okay? So let's read both accounts and then we'll dive in. The Luke account from the Sermon on the Plain says, this is Luke 6:46, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great." Now let's read the one in Matthew. "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the torrents raged, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rains fell, the torrents raged, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its collapse." I don't know if you were raised like me, going to Sunday school, but we learned a song. We were taught a song when we were children about the wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. And then, it goes on. The rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. And the house on the rock stood strong. And we had hand motions and all of that. And then there was the foolish man, and he built his house upon the sand. And when his house fell, we went boom. And so it's so interesting how a child perceives a story. Because this child, when I heard that song and heard the story, I was left with the impression that these were two identical houses, looked just alike, side by side. Growing up in South Carolina and spending a lot of time on the beaches of South Carolina, I pictured these houses right there on the sand dunes. And very immature and very uninformed understanding here. But I pictured one crashing when the hurricane came, and the other stood strong. But in my mind, the one that crashed, Jesus just sweetly, miraculously, and powerfully picked that house up and put it back together and stuck it right back there on the sand. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. But, a child's mind thinks what it wants to think, I guess. But anyway, I had an incorrect understanding of what Jesus was trying to say here. The other thing that I learned as I was preparing for the lesson is in Jesus' day, as he is telling this story in the area of Palestine where he was talking. He was talking with the knowledge. He's a carpenter, so I'm sure he had seen lots of houses be constructed from the ground up, and there were areas in the region that had good, solid foundation soil, and enough clay in it to where it was the right mixture of rock and clay, and you could build a house there safely. But there were a lot of areas in Palestine that were sandy. And if you built your house, if you started your house in the fall or winter, you knew that you were building on the sand. But if you were not knowledgeable about the area, as John and I were not knowledgeable about Montana winters, you would maybe in the summertime see that sandy area and think you were building on solid ground, because the 10 or 12 inches of sand that was sitting on top of bedrock got hard as rock in the summer. It was dry and arid, and that sand lost all its moisture, but it just turned to almost like stone. But it wasn't really stone, because when the rains came in the fall, the fall and winter, the sand, the what they thought was hard rock was not stable, and the houses' foundations would crumble. So here we have this parable, and the parable is telling us that there are a lot of similarities between the two builders. We have two builders. We have two houses. We have two foundations, but we have two radically different outcomes to these houses. Both builders hear the instructions of the king, but only one follows the instructions. Chuck Swindoll, in his book, it's written in about 1990-91, Improve Your Serve, he tells us an illustration that he came up with for the purpose of making this point about hearing and not doing. And in his illustration, he says just to imagine that he was a businessman and had this really great business, and it was flourishing so much that he decided, I'm going to see if I can expand in Europe, and I'm going to go to Europe and expand my company over there. But I've got such great people under me. I'm going to leave it in their care, but I will send them instructions while I'm gone. And so he does that. He sends them instructions every week, letters every week, with instructions of what to do to maintain or even continue to flourish in that location. And so he comes back a year later in the illustration, and he finds the building in disrepair. He finds the inventory has dwindled down. They haven't bought new inventory. The place is just a mess. Windows are broken, and people are just sitting around, drinking coffee. And he comes in and he's just completely enraged and perplexed and confused, like, what about this do you not understand? I sent you instructions. I sent you letters. And the foreman of the company or manager says, letters? Oh, yeah, sure. We got every one of them. As a matter of fact, we have had letter study every Friday night since you left. We have even divided all the personnel into small groups and discussed many of the things that you wrote. Some of those things were really interesting. You'll be pleased to know that a few of us have actually committed to memory some of your sentences and paragraphs. One or two memorized an entire letter. Great stuff in those letters. And the boss says, okay, you got my letters, you studied them and you meditated on them and you discussed them and memorized them, but what did you do about them? Do you get the point? A lot of people know what God had to say in his letters to us, but they didn't apply it to their lives. Why not? Well, according to Jesus' parable, there's a good reason why they didn't. Let's look at what he said back in Matthew 7 again, in the lead up to the parable. I mean, it's a huge reality check. Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on that day," that would be the judgment day, "Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?" And we could even say, we knew Scripture. And verse 23 says, "Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness." Wow. Can you imagine? Greg Morse, a writer with desiringgod.org, penned this. "Imagine it. Christ comes in his glory with the armies of angels. They weep and rejoice. They see the manifestly wicked before them, sentenced to condemnation. How fortunate, they think, that I'm not destined to such a fate. I'm not a pagan. We're not the wicked. We are engendered to the tenets of a Christian ethic, and we have had positive thoughts toward Christ. We went to church. We sang the songs with gusto. We even worked wonders and saw others converted. But the harsh reality is in Jesus' words, I never knew you. Now, understand, he's not saying that there will be people who will lose their salvation. Not at all, because he is the great keeper of our souls. He's saying, I never knew you. You may have looked good on the outside. You may have looked like a great Christian that went to church and knew the songs, but I never knew you. We never had a relationship based on my sacrifice on the cross. You never repented. You never submitted and bowed your knee to me. You know, as Jesus was telling these stories, I imagine he had something Isaiah wrote 700 years earlier in the forefront of his mind. Isaiah 28:16 says, "So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic." In other words, when the storms of life come, just like the storms came in the parables. Do you see what Isaiah was saying in this prophecy about the coming Messiah? He was saying that Jesus is our foundation. And if Jesus is not your foundation, then the storms of life, when they come, will reveal that fact. Whereas the storms of life will reveal the reality and the integrity of the foundation that is Jesus Christ. So I want you to understand what's going on in the climax of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as he tells people there are only two kinds of people: those who have him as the foundation of their lives and those who don't. There's not a third category. He's saying, regardless of how a person presents themselves in public, unless they have made Jesus their sure foundation, he will say on Judgment Day, I never knew you. He is also telling us that everyone has storms that hit them, sometimes as unpredictable as a tornado, an earthquake, or a teenage son who commits suicide. Storms that threaten to completely defeat you. And what Jesus is stating here in the parable of these storms is that they reveal our structural foundation. Those whose foundation is Jesus, the chief cornerstone and sure foundation, will weather the storm and come out of it knowing God in a deeper and purer way. Conversely, for the one who may have a house that looks just like his neighbor's, but went with a cheaper foundation, well, the storm's going to take out his house. The storm's going to reveal the truth that he never actually knew Jesus. So, what is the advice from Scripture? Examine yourselves. 2 Corinthians 13:5 says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you fail to meet the test, the foundation test that comes about with a storm. 1 John 2:3-6 says, by this we can be sure that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. If anyone says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments, he is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But if anyone keeps his word, the love of God has been truly perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. Whoever claims to abide in him must walk as Jesus walked. Jonathan Edwards, that great Puritan writer of the 1600s, plainly wrote, godliness consists not in a heart which intends to do the will of God, but in a heart which does it. Warm feelings, best intentions, sincere hopes and wishes about oneself, or positive inclinations toward God and Christ do not in themselves evidence newness of life. Jesus taught in John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Also in Luke 6:46, and as the Sermon on the Plain begins, Lord, Lord, you say, Lord, Lord, but you do not do what I ask you to do. James, the brother of Jesus, also taught in his letter, James 1:22, but be hearers of the word and not doers only. Okay, I'm sorry, I said that backwards, but be doers of the word and not hearers only. Be a hearer, absolutely. We all need to hear. We have to hear and know what the word says, but we must be doers of the word. So just a couple of passages in closing. Hebrews 12:1-3 is one of my all-time favorites, because I think that it gives us confidence as we go through a storm to look to our foundation and to keep our eyes focused there. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off every encumbrance and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with endurance the race set out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such hostility from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Isn't that a great passage that so sums it up, that as we look to Jesus, our author of our faith, the perfecter of our faith, the foundation of our faith, who considered it joy to endure the cross on our behalf. Consider him. Don't grow weary and lose heart, but keep him in focus. He uses this analogy of a runner running a race, which is a great comparison of our life as we go through it, running a race and all the things that life throws at us, every encumbrance that throws at us, every storm. that if we keep our eyes fixed on the finish line, keep that perspective of heaven in mind, we will finish the race well. And then finally, as we think about examining ourselves, the Hebrews passage says, keep your eyes on Jesus, focus on Jesus. But occasionally we need to glance at ourselves. We need to look at how we have been doing and consider that. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "And we all, having been unveiled in face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, even as from the Lord, the Spirit." What a sure foundation, and what a promise we have to behold the glory of the Lord that will actually is being formed in us, and we will ultimately be as He is, full of glory. Ladies, look to Jesus. He is our only sure foundation. And we will see you next week.